Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to the Speed Art Museum. Thanks for joining us tonight for a talk by Jane Kallir. And as you walked in, you probably saw the big construction site. Our new Speed Art Park is coming soon. The first phase will open next spring. We are planting more trees in the fall and are just adding green to our palette. And hopefully you will all come back with your family and friends in the spring and enjoy this 24/7 outdoor gallery and community green space that we are getting ready for. Also, I wanted to mention that so many of our collection galleries are newly installed, and I think personally it is an absolute treat. The curators have done a phenomenal job. They brought out many more works out of storage. There's a beautiful combination of sculptures and paintings and furniture and dinnerware, and it's just a joy to move around. So if you have a little bit of time later, please visit the galleries, and especially the European galleries are back up and open, and the early 20th century is also available to enjoy. I am so pleased that Jane Kallir has agreed to speak to us tonight. She is just a phenomenal researcher and writer and art dealer who has immersed herself into the family business of Austrian and German expressionism, and she's an expert on the works of Egon Schiele and Gustav Klimt and Oskar Kokoschka, so many artists that are so dear to my heart and to the hearts of our curators. And as the title insinuates, it was her father, Otto Kallir, who opened the Neue Galerie in Vienna, and then during the Second World War had to leave Austria and had 2 stops in Switzerland and in Paris, and then ended up in the United States and opened the eponymous Gallery Saint-Étienne in New York in 1939. And as you can maybe imagine, or as you know from history books, the United States at the time was not quite ready for all of these modern artists. So they did, her father and then later Jane did just incredible groundwork of introducing these artists to a wider public. And not only did they focus on these by now world-renowned Austrian and German artists, but they also discovered such famous American painters such as Grandma Moses in the 1940s. So they did incredible service to the art world, to the world of culture in general, and we are just so very pleased to have her here tonight. So I want to introduce our chief curator, Erika Homke-Squall, and she will introduce Jane a little bit more officially, but I'm very delighted that you're all here, and I think we have a real treat ahead of us.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you here tonight. Rafaela really did lay the groundwork, and it's such an honor and a privilege to welcome Dr. Kallir here as the head president of the Kallir Research Institute, and of course, really kind of leading the way with Gallery Saint-Étienne all of these years, and of course the family legacy. You're going to hear much more about this story in a moment from Jane herself, but I just want to just really emphasize some of what you have meant to 20th century art history, European art history. She is the author of over 20 art history books, including the first comprehensive catalog raisonné of works by the Austrian artist Egon Schiele, we're going to hear a little bit more about. She has curated exhibitions for dozens of museums in the United States, Europe, and Asia, including Baltimore, Columbus, Carnegie, Indianapolis, San Diego, the National Gallery, the Museo di Vittoriano in Rome, Seoul, South Korea, Tokyo, the Belvedere, and the Wien Museum in Vienna. Just tonight, Jane was telling me that she has so many other projects lined up in the queue, including a major exhibition of the work of Grandma Moses that is opening at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and traveling to Crystal Bridges, as well as some other major exhibitions and exciting things to learn about. On a personal note, I have to admit, I am especially excited tonight to meet one of my art history heroes. As an undergraduate enrolled in an early 20th century art history class, I checked out Dr. Kallir's catalog raisonné on Egon Schiele, and I kept it checked out the whole year. The artwork itself lured me in, from one angsty young adult to another from across the decades. But what kept me hooked was the scholarship, the idea that you could research, document, contextualize an entire artist's career and dive so deeply into the artworks and the stories, the pathways and the journeys that each of these artworks took. And I remember how exciting that all was. There's so much potential, so much good and interesting work to get passionate about. So in a roundabout way, I suppose that I have somehow landed where I am now, thanks to you, Jane. Tonight you are going to hear about an incredible family legacy and what that has meant for writing, rewriting, and shaping art history. You are all in for a treat. Please make sure to turn off your cell phones and unwrap your hard candies and settle in, because it is my privilege and honor to welcome tonight Dr. Jane Kallir.
Wow, well, those were great introductions, both of you. I hope I can live up to all of that. And I'd like to thank, first of all, everybody here at the Speed for inviting me here tonight. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming to join us this evening. When we think about Austrian modernism today, two names, I think, come immediately to mind. They've already been mentioned this evening, Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele. But I, as you know, will be focusing on a third person, my grandfather, Otto Kallir, without whose efforts the art of Klimt and Schiele might never have become known here in the US. My grandfather was born in Vienna in 1894. His father was a well-to-do Jewish attorney who encouraged his three sons to collect all sorts of things, coins, stamps, historical documents. Well, Otto, as a young boy, developed a particular interest in aviation, which was then in its infancy. He hoped to become an aeronautical engineer, but after a few weeks at Vienna's Technische Hochschule, he realized that this profession was so rife with anti-Semitism, he'd never succeed. So instead, he combined his interests in art and fine printing to found a publishing firm, the Verlag Neue Galerie, which specialized in limited edition books and portfolios containing original graphics. Between 1919 and 1923, the Verlag Neue Galerie issued roughly 30 books and portfolios, of which the best remembered is Das graphische Werk von Egon Schiele, which comprised the first published editions of the artist's etchings and his two final lithographs. Schiele would remain one of my grandfather's principal interests for the rest of his life. In 1923, Kallir decided to open an art gallery, which he called the Neue Galerie. This concept of newness, expressed in the names of both the gallery and the Verlag, was closely associated with Austrian modernism. More specifically, I think he took the name from Schiele, whose artist group, established in 1909, had been called the Neue Kunstgruppe. The Neue Galerie's first exhibition, quite logically, was a Schiele retrospective. The artist had died just 5 years earlier in 1918, when he was only just beginning to experience critical and financial success. Now it was up to others to sustain his reputation and create a market for his work. In keeping with his passion for Schiele, my grandfather was drawn to the work of artists with a humanistic orientation, artists capable of extracting profound insights from the minutiae of daily life. He showed Austrians, like Gustav Klimt, Oskar Kokoschka, and Alfred Kubin, and also brought the work of foreign modernists, including Edvard Munch, Max Beckmann, Paul Signac, Auguste Renoir, and Vincent van Gogh, to Vienna. There were group shows of French Impressionists, the Russian avant-garde, and the Italian Futurists, and quirky detours, like a 1927 presentation of cacti. For larger shows, such as a 1928 Schiele retrospective, the Neue Galerie teamed up with the Hagenbund Artists Society. From a present-day vantage point, Otto Kallir's most important achievement during his Vienna years may have been the publication of the first Schiele catalog raisonné, which documented the artist's paintings and their ownership before the works were dispersed during and after the Holocaust. The Nazis' wide-ranging attacks on freedom of expression focused particularly on modern art, which Hitler, who was himself a frustrated artist, really hated. German museums were purged of modern works, which were then put on view in the infamous 1937 Degenerate Art exhibition. This page from the Degenerate Art catalog asks readers to guess which of the illustrated works are by Oskar Kokoschka and which by a mental patient. And the, what do they call it here? The inmate of a madhouse is what the Nazis call this person, and it's the work in the upper right-hand corner, and the other two are by Kokoschka. Kokoschka actually was the only Austrian artist who was well known enough in Germany to be directly targeted by the Nazis. But that didn't matter. Austria had its own fascist dictator, Engelbert Dollfuss. In tandem with this political shift, tastes became more conservative, and works by expressionists like Schiele lost much of their audience. Between 1930 and 1932, Schiele watercolor prices declined by 80%. The Neue Galerie was forced to focus on more traditional 19th century material. And the gallery's financial problems were further compounded by the Depression, which swept through Europe following the 1929 US stock market crash. To make ends meet, my grandfather had to sublet some of the Neue Galerie space to an acting school, and he picked up a side gig photographing local stage and opera stars. Kallir was acutely aware of the precariousness of his position. He closely followed events in Germany, and he had no illusions about what would happen to him and his family if Hitler ever came to Austria. Already in 1934, he'd sold his collection of aeronautical memorabilia in Switzerland and banked the sales proceeds there. It was that emergency fund which gave him the wherewithal to flee fairly quickly after Germany annexed Austria in March 1938. Nevertheless, it took him several months to make the necessary arrangements, and the Nazis wasted no time cracking down on Jews and other perceived enemies. My grandfather's interests in emerging technologies had led him, among other things, to become an avid ham radio operator. About a week after the Anschluss, the Gestapo came to confiscate his broadcasting equipment, which obviously was a threat to Nazi media control. When the Nazis saw the size of the apparatus, they said they'd have to call for a truck. So my grandfather invited them to wait in the library. Here, the Gestapo thugs came face to face with Kokoschka's painting, The Knight Errant, which today belongs to the Guggenheim. This type of Jew art will have to be purged once and for all, one of them sneered. My grandfather calmly explained that Kokoschka wasn't a Jew, but a, quote, Viennese punk just like you. Fortunately, the Nazi thought that was funny. The Gestapo also confiscated the family's passports, but my grandfather had the presence of mind to ask for a receipt, and the next day he went down to the police station and retrieved them. Since Jews were no longer allowed to own businesses, my grandfather transferred the Neue Galerie to his Gentile secretary, Vita Künstler. This was a rare example of a so-called friendly Aryanization, unlike the forced sales that were so common at the time. Künstler not only helped preserve the gallery's inventory, she also supervised the packing up of my grandparents' apartment so that its contents could be sent to them abroad. My grandfather was fortunate insofar as much of the art he handled was of no interest to the Nazis, and there were no export restrictions on living artists like Kokoschka or artists who, like Schiele and Klimt, had died within the last 20 years. So Kallir was able to export much of his inventory. A few works by 19th century artists crossed out on this export list had to be left behind. Carrying only hand luggage and assuming the guise of casual tourists, my grandparents' father and aunt fled to Switzerland on June 16, 1938. Had they remained in Austria one day longer, my grandfather would have been arrested. Although my family initially wanted to settle in Switzerland, the Swiss wouldn't give my grandfather a work permit. So he traveled on to Paris, where he opened a new gallery. He called this one Saint-Étienne, after the Cathedral of St. Stephen, which stood about a block from the original Neue Galerie. The name would have been meaningful to the by then growing Austrian refugee community in France, and I suspect the Christian connotations may have been an attempt to dodge French anti-Semitism. The French did allow my grandfather to work, but they wouldn't grant entrance visas to the rest of the family. So the search continued for a country that would take everyone. Alice Jonas, the American-born ex-wife of Otto's brother Alfred, proved crucial in that regard. She'd written my grandparents right after the Anschluss, encouraging them to immigrate to America. Already in June 1938, her second husband, Robert Jonas, a farmer in upstate New York, had filed an affidavit pledging his assets as collateral to secure my family's entry to the U.S. Given that Alice's marriage to Alfred had ended badly, the Jonases' generosity really cannot be overstated. Still, it took over a year for the visas to come through. On August 16, 1939, my family finally set sail for New York. As it turned out, this was one of the last boats to leave Europe before war was declared. The Nazis would overrun Paris less than a year later. The Galerie Saint-Étienne on West 57th Street opened in November 1939, with an exhibition of classical Austrian masters, complemented, for good measure, by Viennese porcelain and a selection of major musical manuscripts. This presentation would surely have been a hit in Vienna, but in New York it was a complete flop. The Herald Tribune called the exhibition, quote, a quaint display. If Kallir couldn't count on classical Austrian art to pull his new gallery through, he had even greater difficulty with Austrian modernism. Klimt, Schiele, and Kubin had at the time absolutely no international standing or market value. Only Kokoschka was known in the US. Rather than giving up, however, my grandfather redoubled his efforts on behalf of the Austrian modernists. In the summer of 1940, less than a year after arriving in the US, he showcased the most important works he'd brought to New York in an exhibition he called, quite appropriately, Saved from Europe. These works, he noted in the press release, have escaped destruction by air raids, fire, or water, or, he added facetiously, at best, the honor of wandering into some Nazi collection, end quote. In a very real sense, Saved from Europe set forth the Galerie Saint-Étienne's agenda for the ensuing decades. The show included a few works by well-known Europeans, such as this spectacular Picasso self-portrait, which had been brought to the U.S. by the family of the Austrian poet Hugo von Hofmannsthal. But the emphasis was on pioneering lesser-known Germans and Austrians, like Paula Modersohn-Becker, who in 2017 finally made it into MoMA's collection, and whose first U.S. museum exhibition is presently on view in New York. Also, Lovis Corinth, Käthe Kollwitz, who was the subject of a recent MoMA retrospective, Gustav Klimt, and, of course, Egon Schiele. Unfortunately, the response to Saved from Europe was once again hardly encouraging. The Herald Tribune commented that while, quote, a good many of these canvases by reputable Europeans are definitely worth saving from Europe, we are not sure that the reception here to the paintings of Schiele and Klimt will be all that may be expected for them. It is difficult to awaken enthusiasm at this time for artists so little known and appreciated here and for so many years past from the contemporary scene in Europe, end quote. Americans, my grandfather noted, were only interested in French art, and then only if the prices were low. The economic impact of the Great Depression lingered on. So, not surprisingly, Schiele's first American one-man show, held at the Galerie Saint-Étienne in 1941, was also a nearly complete disaster. With watercolors priced at $60, drawings at $20, only this one work sold. It was purchased for $250 by a refugee collector who paid out the sum in $13 monthly installments. My grandfather really didn't know anyone in America outside the refugee community, and almost none of them had any money. For the first 2 decades of its existence, the Galerie Saint-Étienne was largely sustained financially by the art of Grandma Moses, whom my grandfather discovered in 1940, and who went on to become one of the most famous and successful female painters of the post-war period. But that's a story for another day. In 1949, my grandfather made his first trip back to Vienna, a city now in ruins. The Neue Galerie had recently been restituted to him, but he never seriously considered returning permanently to his birthplace, and Austrian regulations made it almost impossible for him to run the gallery from abroad. Austria's restitution efforts were often sabotaged by such procedural obstacles, as well as by entrenched anti-Semitism. Most people, both in Europe and in the US, just wanted to put the war behind them. My grandfather, who was familiar with the contents of many pre-war art collections, had many contacts in the émigré community, and was himself a victim of Nazi persecution, became one of the few people who continued aggressively advocating for the restitution of looted art. Among the looting victims, whom my grandfather tried to help, were the heirs of Johann Strauss, known as the composer of the Blue Danube Waltz, Alma Mahler-Werfel, whose Edvard Munch painting had been stolen by her Nazi stepfather, and Leah Bondi, whose Schiele portrait of Wally was literally ripped from her wall by a Nazi art dealer. Kallir's initial restitution efforts weren't particularly successful, but in 1997 I gave his file on Portrait of Wally to the New York Times. The ensuing uproar prompted Austria to change its restitution laws in 1998. As a result, the Strauss heirs got their musical manuscripts back in 2001, and the Munch was restituted in 2006. In 2010, the heirs of Leah Bondi received a settlement of $19 million for her Schiele. Now, the magnitude of that Schiele settlement shows you how incredibly the value of Schiele's work has risen since the 1940s. But back then, it was very slow going for my grandfather. He had to gradually establish an American collector base for Schiele, Klimt, Kokoschka, and other Austrians by repeatedly showing their work at the Galerie Saint-Étienne. Above all, he cultivated relationships with U.S. museums. If he couldn't sell the paintings, he gave them away. In 1956, my grandfather donated Gustav Klimt's beautiful landscape, Pear Tree, to the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard. And the following year, he sold the Museum of Modern Art its first Klimt. Bolstered by this institutional support, the Galerie Saint-Étienne mounted Klimt's first American one-man show in 1959. Today, it's hard to believe the artist had never before had a solo exhibition here, but Kallir previously hesitated, in part because the artist's drawings lacked the color and decorative impact of the oils. My grandfather had to wait until he not only had a sufficient number of paintings, but also a public that was primed to accept Klimt in his entirety. Another landmark was the acquisition in 1954 of Schiele's monumental Portrait of Paris von Gütersloh by the Minneapolis Institute of Art. In order to get the painting into the museum, Kallir reduced the price to $1,500, a bargain even in those days. One of my grandfather's staunchest allies in the museum community was Thomas M. Messer, a Czech émigré who fell in love with Schiele at the Galerie Saint-Étienne in the 1950s. Messer and Kallir collaborated on the first museum exhibition of the artist's work, which opened at the Boston Institute of Contemporary Art, where Messer was then director, in October 1960, and subsequently traveled to 4 additional institutions across the country, including, as a matter of fact, the Speed Art Museum. When, several years later, Messer was appointed director of the Guggenheim, Kallir immediately approached him about doing another Schiele show. That exhibition, which paired Schiele with Klimt, opened at the Guggenheim in 1965 and decisively put both painters on the map. In gratitude, my grandparents gave the Guggenheim Schiele's portrait of his father-in-law, Johann Harms. The so-called Portrait of an Old Man had been Kallir's first Schiele acquisition. He'd showed it to my grandmother, sitting in another dealer's window, when they were first courting in 1922, and the painting had accompanied them everywhere ever since. Shortly before his death in 1978, my grandfather gave Klimt's baby to the National Gallery of Art. This final donation, I think, was particularly meaningful to him because it represented the recognition by his adopted land of Austria's contribution to modernism. The seeds planted by Otto Kallir, however, didn't really come into full bloom until the 1980s. Suddenly, Vienna 1900 was hugely popular, subject of major survey exhibitions at the Venice Biennale, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and in Vienna itself. Ever since then, books and exhibitions on fin de siècle Vienna have flourished. Klimt and Schiele are mainstays of the Austrian tourist industry. Their most famous paintings featured on an array of kitschy tchotchkes. It's hard to imagine there ever was a time when works by these artists were so hard to sell, my grandfather literally had to give them away. Today's exorbitant prices sometimes make it difficult to separate the humanistic or aesthetic value of an artwork from its monetary value. Otto Kallir didn't do what he did for money. He didn't buy art because he thought it would appreciate in value, but because he believed in the artists. He thought these artists were historically important, and he was therefore committed to documenting and promoting their work. Collecting was Kallir's way of understanding the world and giving meaning to life, dealing beyond the need to survive economically was a way to share his enthusiasms with others and to ensure that the artworks survived for generations to come. Thank you. So do we want to do questions?
Yes, I think we have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has anything. Oh.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful presentation and the work of your grandfather, which is, just so amazing. I'm wondering how much you can say about the ways that Jews were involved not only in being the repositors and gallery owners, both in Vienna and in Paris as well, but how they helped to catapult the modernism that we see today, which I think your grandfather was so much a part of.
I think that is absolutely correct. And I think that, when I first started working in the gallery, which was in the late 1970s, most of the top dealers in New York were Europeans of one sort or another. Now, I don't know their backstories. Some of them were too young to have fled the Nazis. But many of them were Jewish, and many of them also left, in the turmoil after the war as well. So if you look at how European modernism came to the U.S., starting really already in the 1940s, and there were artists, there was this amazing cultural influx from all over Europe that really changed the course of art history.
Would you say that your grandfather introduced Grandma Moses to the American public?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. He is really entirely responsible for her fame and career. And the show that we're doing, which was mentioned earlier at the Smithsonian, that's going to open in October of next year, and then travel to Crystal Bridges in Bentonville. That's going to go into this in great depth.
Were your parents involved in the gallery?
No. My grandfather was a tough dad. And my father, my father served in the U.S. Army in World War II, and when he got out, I think he came to work for the gallery, and I think he lasted about a week. And then my grandfather took him into his office, and he said, this isn't going to happen.
Any last questions?
I'm just curious, how did your grandfather discover Grandma Moses?
There's a short answer, there's a long answer. I'll try and give you a sort of a medium answer. He really liked America. I mean, he was absolutely, from almost day one, enamored of everything American. He thought it was a fantastic country, and he almost immediately he got a car and he drove to the Southwest. This was without interstates, without air conditioning, without anything, because he was interested in indigenous culture. I mean, he loved everything. What he did not like was American mainstream contemporary art. He thought it was really, really boring and derivative. And so there was sort of this interest in folk art and self-taught artists that was being promoted by museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, in the 1930s. So it was sort of something that was already in the air. And a collector came and brought him literally a car trunk full of her paintings. He said, "Yeah, this is great. I'll give her a show." And that was that.
Wow, incredible. Any other last minute questions? Oh, I see one more hand. Okay, this will probably be our last one. Oh, two more, okay.
So thank you so much for your stories.
You're very welcome.
And I also want to ask you if your grandfather or anybody else that he worked with was involved with the repatriation of art we've all seen the rape of Europa, the documentary, The Monuments Men. Was he involved with any of that?
Well, he would have, okay. The Monuments Men was a very specific sort of elite group of U.S. soldiers, many of whom had an art background and were recruited for that purpose. My grandfather was too old to serve in the Army in World War II, so no, he wouldn't have been part of that team. What he did really almost completely on his own and without any institutional support. He would just go to Vienna and try to badger the authorities into giving stuff back, which, I mean, the Monuments Men is like, it's one could do a whole talk, more than one whole talk on just this. The philosophy of, okay, I'll give you all a little bit of background because not everybody may know what we're talking about. So Hitler was, Hitler was shipping art all over Europe. He was, people were profiting from art by selling it. It was mainly old masters. Hitler did not like modern art, but you could also kind of deal in modern paintings under the table, and Hitler was very glad to get the cash for, let's say, a prime Matisse or a Picasso or a Monet, or, you know, even if he didn't like the artists themselves. So after the war, there was all of this art that had been moved all over Europe, and the US Army came in and they had to figure out what to do with it and who it belonged to, which was just a completely impossible task. So that's what the monuments were. They were the people whom we sent over there to try to sort this out. And what they did, and this is one of the problems that we're still grappling with today, they figured that they would try to determine where the art came from and send it back there. So if it came from Germany, it went back to Germany. If it came from Austria, it went back to Austria, and so on and so forth. And then it was up to the countries to return the art to its rightful owner, which very often they didn't do. Or they did, they may, I mean, I know most about Austria, but I think actually most of the, I mean, France was bad, Holland was bad. They were all kind of not great about this. Germany, which we had more control over after the war, was a little bit better.
Oh, I think there was a movie made too, wasn't there, of the Monument Men?
There are so many movies on this, and none of them are any good. You have to be really careful of those movies. You know, they're way over dramatized. But there are a number of good books, and the book that this lady mentioned, The Rape of Europa, is actually is an excellent book. It's old now. It was really the book that put this subject on the map. And so I'm not sure, I haven't reread it in a while. I'm not sure how, you know, I mean, there might be things that you would update today if you were rewriting it, because we know a lot more. But The Rape of Europa is a good book. There is a Rape of Europa documentary, which is pretty good. The Monuments Men is George Clooney.
Thank you for it all. I'm wondering, you mentioned that you began working in your grandfather's gallery in the 70s. What drew you into that work, and how did that lead to your academic career? I assume you're with a university, you're publishing all these books.
No, I just do that on my own, actually. Because I want to. As a kid, I was interested in two things, art and writing. And like most kids, I thought, I want to be an artist or I want to be a writer. I don't think anybody, at least back in those days, as a kid says, I want to grow up and be an art dealer. And one day when I was about 16 years old, my grandfather took me aside and he said, you know, you're not good enough to be an artist. You're going to come work for the gallery. And I was so furious. But then I went to college and I majored in art and art history, and I needed a job. And so I thought, I'll try this out. And I loved it. And what I really liked and still like is combining my interest in art and writing about art.
Okay, let's give one more round of applause for Jane.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Our galleries are open tonight until 8 p.m., so feel free to stick around and enjoy our galleries. And Jane, really quick, before you step away, if people want to learn more about the Kallir Research Institute, what's the best way to learn a little bit more after tonight?
Well, we have a really bad website, but we're in the process of redoing it. It's KallirResearch.org. I mean, it's very easy to find. I would also, we also have a really good Schiele website, which we're also in the process of redoing, but that has a lot, that's much more robust and full of information than the KRI website, and that's egonschieleonline.org. So I would refer you to both of those.
Okay, great. And we'll all meet up at the Grandma Moses show in a year. See you there.